16 hot dogs, 16 days, and 16 stories. This is 16 for 16. I'm Mary Bowers, a Korean-American adoptee and competitive eater. I'm about to step onto the biggest stage in all of world sports, the Nathan's Famous Hot Dog Eating Contest at Coney Island, New York. And this time, I'm bringing some of my friends along the way to share their stories. Meet Jess, a Korean-American adoptee and researcher. Let's catch up. Today we're talking about gestation, generations, and genetic mirrors. I am here with Jess. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where do you live? What do you do? Just get into a little bit of how did you get there?
I'm Jess. I was adopted from South Korea to the US. I am currently in Melbourne, Australia. My first trip back to Korea was like so many things, traumatic, eye-opening, life-changing in the truest meaning of all those words. From that, I was like, I need to know more about this. And my usual approach to things is reading and writing because I'm a researcher and I've written a lot of things on adoption since that point in my life. And that's what motivated me to pursue a PhD research project on adoption and talking to other adoptees about their experiences. And so since then, I've really connected with the adoptee community, not just Korean adoptees, but all intercountry adoptees. And that's been incredible, especially on that global scale. Yeah.
Okay. And so in the course of your research, obviously this is something that's also very personal to you. How do you blend the two elements of like this very personal, close to heart thing with like very pragmatic, practical research? And do you think that's a tool that actually helps you in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, definitely research coming from people who have that lived experience is so important, especially in the adoption area, because so much of that work prior to adoptees doing that research has been by non-adopted people. And that's definitely impacted the depths of understanding that we can have about the impacts of adoption, for example. But at the same time, because it's so close to is who I am, it's just very challenging emotionally and physically and all of that. So my community is what keeps me going really through all of that.
I think right now the prevailing narrative is that it is family building, and there is not a lot of attention paid to the family separation element of it. What are some of the effects that you have found, not just with adoptees, but in general? What are some of the effects of families being separated?
It's been a combination of this adoption research that I've come to understand some of these things, but also and primarily as a parent. When I first was pregnant with my daughter and just going through these like very generic prenatal classes, it was really confronting because it was just common knowledge. And it was this common knowledge about the importance of especially the mother and child connection and this family security and attachment that was just discussed as if it was just like, oh yes, we breathe oxygen. As an adoptee, so much of the narrative is drowned out by, oh, this has been the greatest thing, forming different families and you're so loved and you should be so grateful and aren't you so lucky, and all of those like actually quite toxic narratives that drown out what actually happened to us. All of that can be, not all of it, but like the different family formations obviously can be a very positive thing. But the narratives around being lucky and feeling grateful really undermine and diminish that importance of those early connections. It's through learning all that as a parent, and some of that through the research, is that early childhood experiences, especially from infancy, from birth until 3 years old, even before birth, have huge lifelong actual impacts on your learning, your mental and physical health, your emotional ability to emotionally regulate, ability to have stable relationships and handle stress, so all of it was just so like, oh my goodness, it does have a huge impact. And I guess, in the adoption space, we talk about the primal wound and everything, but really understanding how the brain works has been really like, as a way to communicate to people how important it is. I think some people are like, oh, but hasn't it been great being adopted? I'm like, no, well, it's like, those two are mutually exclusive. It's like, but this thing happened. And one of the leading centers on this in the US is the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. And they've written a lot about the impacts and importance of those early childhood experiences and how foundational it is to brain architecture and how that foundation provides literally that foundation for everything else that we build on. And to be separated from our mothers in particular from birth, like the minute we're born, pretty much for so many of us, and is so like against every best practice principle or caring.
How old old were you when you were adopted?
I was adopted,
Okay.
but I guess from the records that I know, when I was born, it was about, I think it was like 5 days or so that I was just at the orphanage because I was underweight and malnourished when I was born. And so I don't know what happened in those 5 days, but like there's so many black boxes. And then I was placed with a foster.
Okay, so kind of blending these two universes of what we know in our head and then what we know in our heart. What are some of the major development milestones that happen in like a 5-day period from birth? What are some of the milestones that somebody should be hitting by like 8 months old? And what did you see in your daughter? Did that kind of strike certain emotions in you when she hit those milestones?
Oh, 100%. I'm just clear. I'm not like an early childhood expert, but it's just kind of stuff I've learned as a parent and through a little bit from the research. But one thing that really stood out for me in those prenatal classes was the facilitator was asking us, what do you think a child can sense when they're in the womb? And some of us were like, oh, maybe hearing, sound, hearing, maybe taste because they're in the amniotic fluid and all of that. But actually, the facilitator was like, actually, it's all the senses that they can see, after a certain period, they can smell. And those are the things that is their whole world, like before a baby's born. And when they're born, that's what they're searching for. They search immediately for that sound of the voice of the mother, the smell of the mother, feel, and all of that, like to really attach and to really just feel secure in the world. And to not have that as an adoptee just throws everything up in the air. You feel groundless. And I think for a lot of people as adults, we continue to feel that groundlessness, like, do we really belong anywhere? And so much of that is from that early attachment that we didn't have. And so when I was going through all that with my daughter, and just seeing, how much she developed by the time she was 8 months old, she was so responsive, so engaged, so attached to us. And I had to keep reminding myself that her experience is not my experience. And it was really hard for me at first to actually connect with her because it was so confronting how much she needed me, how much she was attached to me, how much I was her world. And to acknowledge that was to also acknowledge I didn't have that. And it was just like really full on. And so I think, all of my life, people are like, oh, you were just a baby. What do you remember? Anything? Like, oh, you're like this blank slate. And I'm like, that is such a damaging narrative and completely false.
I would say for me, like I have had this fear of having my own children because I am worried about being jealous of them.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, it's bizarre because they're hypothetical children that don't even exist. And yet it's this thing that definitely has driven a lot of my relationships, my ability to connect, because it's just something that we don't have. Often when we talk about adoption, we talk about adoptees sometimes, we talk about certainly adoptive parents, sometimes biological parents, but we don't often talk about the intergenerational impact that it leaves. How old is your daughter, and kind of what is the way that you explain, like she still has to do the family tree history project at school that we all hated so much as adoptees. And she probably has the same, like, I can't fill in this circle because I don't know.
Exactly. She's 4 years old now. She just turned 4 and she'll be going to school next year. So I have so much anxiety around this whole process on so many levels. And we'll talk about the racism stuff later. But that's like the intergenerational trauma that I've been through a lot of there to try and make sure I don't pass that on. But that's really hard because, like I said, I had a hard time bonding with her when I first started. Experienced postnatal depression and all of that. And so on some level, I have passed on some of that stress to her, and I'm just trying to mitigate that and make sure that doesn't continue to impact her, And then, of course, the side of like my health history. I don't know what I've passed on to her at a genetic level. And all I can do is provide as much support I can for her and be an open book. And I think I had a realization that because, I married a guy who's a white Australian, and basically our whole known extended family are not Korean, are not, and so it's just me and her. And I'm like, when I was in my darkest moments, I was like, I can't leave her, she'll have no one. Like, I have to stay on this earth. I think just being, like her experience is not my experience, like with school, and inevitably experiences some form of racism, she'll have to help talk her through and understand that. And so not passing on that trauma intergenerational like that. I didn't get that from my parents. Yeah. It's a lot.
It's the challenge too. It's like we do so much work. We put in the effort. We go, like a lot of us go to therapy. Like we're very aware of the impacts, but then there's also a certain limit to that as well, because this whole field of epigenetic that we've inherited
And I think that's an emerging field of science. It's like, I would love to see more research into that particular field, because I think it is important in absence of some of the genetic histories that we carry. Can you help me understand? I grew up in Eastern Colorado. I had very, very few racial mirrors. And the only other racial mirrors that I had in that environment were also adoptees trying to figure out what the heck is going on. Returning to Korea, I've had the experience now of those racial mirrors, but I have no idea what it's like to have a genetic mirror. So if you were to explain that experience to somebody, what is that like?
My daughter's 4 years, and it's really only now that 4 years that she's been on this planet that I'm starting to see similarities, physical similarities between me and her. Since she was born, everyone's like, oh, she's your mini. Oh, she looks exactly like you. And I'm like, I don't see it. I don't see it because, first of all, I've never seen myself in relation to another person. So my physical features are almost just like there. They're just there. Like I have no reference point. So I'm like, I don't know, it's just, this is my nose. These are my ears. Like I can't see myself in it. And like growing up, I was like, I can't see myself reflected in other people. But after having a child, I was like, wow, this is so profound, because I actually can't see myself reflected in my own biological child. And
that's really interesting.
Other people are like, no, she looks like you. I'm like, no, she's way cuter. She's like, I don't know, just all these different, like, I don't know, just, I did not see it.
I think part of that too is like, for a lot of us, we have this gap in time. Like I observe what parents do, especially like with social media, they post pictures of their kids like from birth. And I have 3 pictures from the time that I was born until I was 5 months old. And I mean, they're terrible pictures. They look like mugshots. You know which ones I'm referring to. You know, the ones from Eastern that we all have. And I'm like,
the red chair.
I thought this was supposed to make us look adoptable. You're not doing us any favors. Like we look like we're doing time.
I probably felt like that, to be honest.
But like, there's this gap of, I don't even know what I looked like at that age. So I don't have the frame of reference to compare. Is that maybe like kind of?
Yeah. And like, I hadn't seen many like Asian babies either, or Asian people.
That's true.
What people look like. I mean, just one example was when I was doing research in Korea, and people, they need to know how old you are. They ask you how old you are. I had my students who were guessing, and they were pretty spot on. I was like, oh. Whereas in the US or Australia, they're like, they always assume I look younger. I'm younger. But in Korea, they're like, oh no, you're like 35 at the time, And I'm like, oh.
I don't know. The students who I teach, they're like, they start at 16 and then their next guess skips to 102. So I think it's amazing. But I think one of the things that I would like to see emerge out of the TRC investigation, I think we realize the severity of what happened in the past. And even though there's this reconciliation part that comes with that, I think for a lot of us, it's not like that is not enough. It's preventing harm in the future. Absolutely. So what are some of the things, like having gone through this experience yourself, and then also being a parent and raising a daughter, what are some of the things that you think all children should be entitled to?
Being connected to people that are their family, just having that access, having that full knowledge of their background and identity, and being able to continually connect with this, like to have that sort of open arrangement where, guided as time goes on, which, it might, and it should be up to the person, the child and their parents and their extended family, biological families, that they determine how that relationship molds or changes over time, rather than agencies deciding, oh, this is in your best interest.
The thing that I keep saying about family search, because I think the deterrent that we're always presented with, and I hear it from friends, I hear it from adoptive family, is what if you find them and they don't want you? And that is the first question that is usually asked. The first assumption is not, what if you find them and it goes well? The assumption is always that it's going to go bad. And to me, I feel like that rejection coming from them holds more value than to hear it from an adoption agency who is now under investigation for falsifying records. We know about some of the coercive practices that they're accused of carrying out. I need to hear it from my family that this was their choice, that there was not coercion, that I wasn't stolen. Like, that's the validation that I need. And whatever that choice is, that's our family decision.
So much power and agency has been taken